Great to be here again. Can I just... Did anyone see my talk last time at Breaking Convention? We had... Oh wow, groupies. Cool. So I should just point out before I start that the views expressed in this presentation, not necessarily those of the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. They maybe say that, they're paying for this trip. They don't really know what I'm going to talk about though. But anyway, so if you're thinking, is that a machine elf or is that an alien? I couldn't decide whether I preferred aliens or elves, so I thought I'd go for sort of an elf alien, but you know, it's my presentation, I can do what I like. So, what is it like to be a machine elf? Well, I'll tell you, it's fucking awesome. That's it, thank you very much. Any questions? Okay, but no, seriously. So what I want to do is kind of answer a couple of questions, or at least lead towards kind of answering these questions. First of all, to borrow Thomas Nagel's terminology, is there something it's like to be a machine elf? So do machine elves possess subjective consciousness? And that I think is more interesting than saying, are they real? Because if something possesses subjective consciousness, it is real, it's really real. Because as Descartes famously showed, the only thing he was unable to deny was his own mind, his own kind of self-own subjective consciousness. So perhaps we'll be able to answer that question. And secondly, if they do possess subjective consciousness, what is it like to be a machine elf? That's perhaps slightly more difficult to answer, so I'm not going to promise a kind of definitive answer to that question. But hopefully by the end of the talk you might get the impression that the question, what is it like to be a machine elf, is perhaps not that much more difficult than what is it like to be a bat. But even that is quite a difficult one, but, you know, give me a break. Okay, so I'm not going to start talking about machine elves. I'm going to ask first the question, what is it like to be you? Or to perhaps pin it down a little bit more concretely, how do you see the world? And as a neuroscientist, I tend to, of sorts, I tend to turn to this gelatinous information-generating, information-processing lump of machinery in your head, the brain. And so the first part of the talk I'm going to if you've seen me speak before, some of this stuff will be familiar, but there's no harm in kind of revising it. I'm going to start, sort of give you an idea of how the brain represents the informational structure of your world, and then we will kind of develop the model and try and go inwards and think about what's happening from the subjective perspective, which of course is far more interesting than just looking at neural activity. Okay, so first of all, let's orient ourselves. So we're interested in this outer lobe of the brain, the cortex, which is kind of structured as this mosaic or patchwork of cortical columns kind of sat side by side. So here we're seeing sort of a bird's eye view, and these can be activated to create these patterns of activation, which will be really important as we go through the talk. If you look at them from the side, you can see they have these layers, and it's the interactions between these layers and the connections that give these cortical columns these sort of computational abilities. But we're just going to look at them from this bird's eye view. So when you see these little circles, you're looking at cortical columns. Okay, so let's take a really simple example. Let's imagine, try to think about how does the brain represent the informational structure of a really simple world, such as this cheeky little startled little elf moving in a particular direction. So this is the perceived visual object, but of course there's no little elf sitting in your brain. There is a cortical representation. So here we have a 4x4 grid of cortical columns, and here I've labelled them nicely for you to show you that there are columns that are specialised to represent motion, colour, form, texture, etc. This is an oversimplification. The neuroscientists in the room saying, well, it's more complicated than that, it's actually a hierarchy here, whatever. But this hopefully gets the idea across. So by activating specific populations of columns, you can represent the informational structure of this little elf face moving to the right, and you can see they're connected, so it forms this unified structure. So that's the informational structure of this little elf, sort of. Okay, but of course the real brain is far more complicated. There are billions of these columns, and so there's effectively an infinite number of patterns of column activation. And so what that means is that the brain is able to essentially represent the informational structure of practically an infinite number of worlds. And this is why you never have the same moment twice, because the brain is perfectly capable of rendering an infinite number of moments from second to second. Now, really important point, you'll notice that these columns that are represented here, they are not independent, but they are connected. And there's a specific pattern of connectivity. And this pattern of connectivity is really important, because by sculpting the patterns of connectivity, you can shape the types of patterns of activation that tend to occur naturally. So, for example, if you activate this bad boy here that's well connected, you preferentially tend to activate columns around him. And so by shaping the connectivity, you can shape the what's called the intrinsic activity of the cortical system. So the cortical system naturally adopts these patterns of activation, and these are, as a default, these will tend to represent the world that you're seeing around you. Your brain is really, really good at building this world. People think sometimes the brain is like this camera that's taking snapshots of the world all the time. Actually, the brain needs very little information to build your phenomenal world because it knows how to do it. We'll talk about dreaming in a second, and that will be a validation of that idea. So the best way to understand how the brain learned to do this is to imagine here we've got a set of cortical columns that are kind of randomly interconnected. And by sampling data from this world, the consensus world, you activate specific column populations, and this tends to strengthen the interactions between these certain populations. And over time, and we're talking evolution, development, experience, the brain hones its ability to basically build the world around you. And a startling kind of validation of this model is, of course, the dream state. So when you're dreaming, your brain is basically using exactly the same activity as it does during waking to represent the world. So the waking world is really a dream that is being modulated by small amounts of sensory data, if you like. But in the dream state, these parts of the brain, these primary sensory areas, are shut down, but the brain is still perfectly able to build models of the world in exactly the same way as it does for waking. Okay, so when you are awake and when you're interacting with this world, what's actually happening is this intrinsic activity is always kind of humming along all the time. And patterns of sensory data, here represented by a little triangular structure, it's not a triangle, it's some sort of pattern of sensory data from the external environment, is matched to this ongoing activity and tends to amplify certain patterns of activity. So the brain never builds the world from scratch every time you open your eyes. It always has this background context, and it will only accept sensory data that it can match to this ongoing activity. So sensory data that doesn't match, it doesn't exist as far as the brain is concerned. We'll give some more examples of this as we go on. Now, when you introduce a psychedelic drug like LSD or psilocybin, for example, what happens is there's kind of a strict enforcement of this, these patterns of connectivity, that determines the patterns of activation, kind of breaks down for reasons that we don't have time to explain here. And indeed, if you want to read more, you can read my paper, Building a Living World, which I discuss in detail. And I predicted, in fact, in that paper, that what you'd see if you looked at a brain under the influence of LSD or psilocybin is you'd see more patterns of activation, or an increase in the repertoire of activation patterns when you introduce a psychedelic drug. So that was 2013. I spoke about this a lot in the last talk here at Breaking Convention. The following year, the peerless Imperial team and collaborators indeed showed that this is how it works. They didn't reference me, but anyway. I'm kidding. They probably didn't read me. Anyway, so when you introduce DMT, however, into the brain, something rather different seems to happen. Rather than going from a kind of stable and predictable world to a kind of fluid, novel, unpredictable model of this world, the brain seems to undergo this kind of 100% channel reality switch, I think Terence McKenna called it. And that's kind of confounding, because as far as we know, this world is really the only world your brain knows how to build. It doesn't know how to build bizarre alien worlds that have no relationship whatsoever to this reality, are infested by creatures of 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions. So to me, this is really strange and shocking that the brain can suddenly switch and with kind of this effortlessness change from constructing this reality to constructing these unimaginably bizarre realities that you see under DMT. So this is a problem. This is a problem for neuroscientists, I think. Okay, so we've kind of got 2 broad groups, I guess. Now there's that group that says, in terms of the interpretation of the DMT reality, some will say, well, it's some sort of complex hallucination, and we'll be able to explain it in terms of neural structure or whatever possible. Or there's what fell in, I guess, in Dave's talk, the sort of literalist category. It says, well, actually what's happening is that DMT is allowing you to access an alternate reality. And certainly some very prominent individuals in the kind of psychedelic community, ranging from the great bard himself, Terence McKenna, to Graham Hancock, often alluded to a belief that actually DMT does allow you to interact with an alternate reality. So this is how it would work if you were trying to give a simple explanation. As we've seen, during normal waking reality, patterns of sensory data from this world are matched to this ongoing activity. But when you enter the DMT state, the activity changes such that data from the consensus world no longer matches. And what that means, this is why when you smoke DMT, you don't go for a walk in the forest. You close your eyes, you lie down, and you hold on. Because there's no point. The brain simply loses the ability to pass and render data from the consensus world. It's kind of doing its own thing. Or is it? Because some would say, well, actually what's happening is that when the activity, the intrinsic activity of the brain changes, when DMT is present, sensory data from an alien reality is now matching the intrinsic activity of the brain, which means that the brain is able to sample data from this alien reality and build these beautiful alien worlds. So it's very simple. So during normal waking experience, you receive data from this reality, and with DMT, you receive data from an alien reality. Done. However, there is a bit of a problem with this idea. And it's not, people kind of argue fervently over whether these DMT realms and their entities are real. But that's not really the problem, because there's no reason to think that there couldn't be alternate universes infested with a whole myriad of very, very strange creatures. There's quite a few in this room, in this reality. So why wouldn't there be? The problem is not the existence of these worlds. The problem is that we should be able to access them with such facility by smoking, 20, 30, 40, 50 milligrams of this extremely simple molecule, that you should access these worlds. And this is what I call the data input problem. You'll notice that when scientists and philosophers talk about consciousness, they like to invent problems for themselves. So there's the mind-body problem is a good one. The hard problem is probably the most famous one, contrast with the easy problem, which are also quite hard. The problem of other minds, all this kind of stuff. So in that tradition, I've invented my own problem, which is called the data input problem. And so during normal waking reality, we understand exactly how extrinsic data, how sensory data modulates what's going on in the brain, modulates the intrinsic activity. We know that this is blocked during the dream state. The brain continues to construct reality basically in the same way, but basically a model of the waking world. But with the DMT state, there seems to be no mechanism for extrinsic data, sensory data from a completely alternate reality to get into the brain. So that's really the problem. So what I want to do is maybe try and solve this problem. But before we do that, we're really going to have to move our model. So far I've given you this model of these cortical columns, which are kind of activated or deactivated in certain patterns, and it feels all very kind of static. But actually the brain is extremely dynamic, even on the level of individual neurons. which undergo these oscillations at various frequencies and occasional sort of spiking activity. But certainly when you get large groups of neurons, when neurons form networks and loops, then you get very complex activity. Here's kind of a mock EEG. You can see you can decompose that into a number of oscillatory frequencies. So really, it's perhaps a bit more useful to think of the brain, rather than these kind of static moving sort of patterns of activation, as this extremely complex vibrational structure. And indeed, this is the solution of a neural field equation that actually models the brain like that. And you can see these bumps here show these areas of high activation. You can imagine how information can be represented here. So rather than having these kind of discrete columns, we think of the brain as a unified structure that is kind of vibrating. And this is an important way to think about it. Now, so here we've got a circular membrane that is vibrating. And importantly, the structure of this circular membrane determines the mode of vibration that it can adopt. Now, before I said that the brain molds the connectivity between the cortical columns, and so it's these patterns of connectivity, which is the structure, the architecture of the cortex, will determine the patterns of vibration that it can adopt, and thus how it represents the world. So this is basically moving a step on from simply thinking about patterns of activation of the cortex. So perhaps we can instead see the brain as this vibrational structure that is not being matched to sensory activity, but it's sort of resonating, if you like, with patterns of sensory data in the environment. So we've moved things on slightly, and we're now almost unifying the brain and the external world, which I think is quite important that we do. And the structure of these connectivity patterns will determine how the brain is kind of almost tuned to the external world. In the same way you might alter the structure of a bell in order to allow it to resonate with some sort of input sound frequency. And in the same way that when you remove the input sound frequency from a resonating bell, the bell will continue to ring, and the brain will continue to produce this intrinsic activity, continue to vibrate, if you like. And this, of course, is what's happening during dreaming. Now, of course, this also means that sensory data that cannot resonate with this vibrating brain, if you like, basically doesn't exist from the perspective of the individual here. And a kind of a concrete example would be sound frequencies. So sound frequencies, let's say above a certain hertz, would not resonate with the brain, so they wouldn't exist from the perspective of this brain. So the brain is always filtering, it is always resonating with specific patterns of sensory data. Now this, of course, cuts both ways. So if you change the way, by introducing a drug such as DMT, the brain is essentially vibrating, then you also lose that ability to resonate with this same sensory data. So this is what's happening. This is why you close your eyes again. When you lose this, what I described before is you lose the ability to match the sensory data. Here we're describing it slightly differently, in that the brain loses the ability to resonate with this sensory data in a normal way. It's kind of doing its own thing again. Okay, so now what I want to do is move inwards. So we've kind of looked at the activity of the brain from the outside. But there's only so far you can go with that. You really need to go inwards and think about what's happening to consciousness. And that's really the important point. Now I think that human thought has been held up by the splitting of reality. And I don't know exactly which philosopher we can blame with this. I've discussed it with a number of contemporary philosophers, and they come up with various names. But we split the world into the objective being what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin called the without of things, and the subjective, the within of things. So the objective is the world that exists independent of consciousness, independent of mind. The subjective is, of course, the only thing we ever experience. And so we compounded this dichotomization of reality by saying, well, this is the only one that is completely undeniable, so we'll choose this one. This is the fundamental ground of reality, the objective. Now we're going to spend the next 300 years working out how this inert objective reality, inert objective matter, somehow develops subjectivity, which is kind of lunacy when you actually think about it. And, we create all these problems because of that, this splitting of reality, how the hard problem of consciousness, how does dead matter give rise to subjective consciousness, how does this subjective consciousness interact with objective matter, are they the same thing? So what I want to do is really get rid of the objective from now on. So you can forget about this idea of an objective world, and we'll focus on the subjective. Because of course everything comes through the conduit of subjectivity. It's all subjective. So really we're taking the position now, perhaps surprisingly to some of you, that consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality. And it's no more crazy than saying that energy is the fundamental ground of reality, or little vibrating strings are the ground of reality. It's very cute. But of course, this idea, the idea that consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality, has the benefit in that it can never be denied. We can't deny subject, unless you're Daniel Dennett, you can't deny, subjective consciousness. So now we can replace our image of the brain with the image of the subjective consciousness. That's a really difficult thing to do, of course. So I'm loosely going to use Jung's model of the psyche. You can imagine the ego in the centre here, personal consciousness surrounded by personal unconscious, and then this is really the ocean or the matrix of mind. So when you think about a brain, what a brain is a self-organized, self-complexifying structure of consciousness that develops self-reflectivity. So what I call a self-reflective complex. Now, a brain, when you look at a brain of someone else's brain, that of course is their brain from your subjective perspective. So it's kind of a subjective look at another subjective, so it gets a bit complicated. But anyway, so when we do this, what it allows us to do, so far we've moved from this map, this idea of sensory matching, using cortical columns, through to the idea of a brain kind of resonating with the external world. And now, forget about these appendages here, I haven't got time to explain what they are, not important. So now we have the idea that it's actually your consciousness that is vibrating, vibrating maybe not the right word, but it's as good as we're going to get, I think. And that is forming this self-reflective structure within consciousness. So consciousness, just because you think that consciousness is kind of the ground of reality, doesn't mean that it has to be this kind of amorphous structure. Clearly it doesn't. Because consciousness has structure, and it tends to have this kind of irresistible tendency to form these highly complex self-reflective structures, of which all of you in the room are examples of. So when you get many of these self-reflective complexes together, they together form a collective reality. So they all have the same kind of structure, and as we learned before, it's a structure that determines the modes of vibration. And so they tend to resonate with the same kind of patterns of undulations or vibrations or oscillations within kind of the matrix of consciousness, if you like. And so they occupy a collective reality. And as far as they're concerned, as far as we're all concerned, this is the only reality, this is the only one that you can perceive. However, if we expand this idea and we think, well, actually, if consciousness tends to form these extremely diverse and complex structures, and tends to have this, as I said, irresistible tendency to form self-reflective complexes, then if consciousness, as the sort of consciousness matrix, is of a kind of immeasurable scale, there are likely to be areas with very, very different structures. So here I've just represented, this is kind of part of the kind of matrix of consciousness, if you like. And we can see that within each area, each has a different structure, each has different kind of vibrational modes, and so these will tend to have a local collective reality. They will form self-reflective complexes, but they will only be aware of other self-reflecting complexes, other conscious beings, if you like, within their own collective reality. And so self-reflective complexes within this region of the kind of consciousness matrix are completely unaware, they cannot interact with self-reflective complexes within this area of consciousness. Nothing to do with them being too far away or distant. It's simply an issue of these kind of vibrational modes and this kind of resonance idea. Okay, so here's a cheeky little self-reflective complex. So this could be a machine elf, for example. As you can see, he's got a particular structure, which means that he has specific vibrational modes, and he could be located anywhere within this highly complex, perhaps infinite matrix of mind. But of course, as far as this self-reflective complex is concerned, i.e. possibly you, this bad boy doesn't exist, and he's completely inaccessible. There's no interaction whatsoever. You're unaware of this guy, and this guy is completely unaware of you. However, as we have seen, when DMT enters the brain, or now we're looking at it again from the subjective perspective, so really we should say when DMT enters consciousness, it changes the structure, such it changes the vibrational mode. And just to drive this point home, these two diagrams on the left here are equivalent. This is from the kind of looking, I'm not going to say the objective perspective, because that was undermine everything I've been saying, but this is looking at the cortical columns from the perspective of another subjective complex. So these are completely equivalent. So what this means is that when you introduce DMT into a self-reflective complex, such as you, i.e. your brain, you introduce this resonant interaction. So what actually happens is this self-reflective complex becomes part, not metaphorically, but literally becomes part of the collective reality of this self-reflective complex, which means that you can communicate. You are aware of this self-reflective complex, i.e. this machine elf. This machine elf is aware of you. So, finally, is there something it's like to be a machine elf? Well, if the machine elf is a self-reflective complex, then it's just as conscious as you. It's just as unable to deny its own existence as you. How can you deny those eyes, Luke? Yeah? Look at them. So, just as you are aware of their presence, they are aware of yours. How you appear to them, I'm not sure. That's kind of an interesting question. What is it like to be a machine elf? Well, more difficult to answer, as I said at the start. But I can sort of get an idea of what it might be like to be you, because we occupy the same collective reality. So, when you take DMT, you become part of the collective reality of the machine elves. And so, probably, the way you see this DMT realm under the influence of DMT is probably the way the machine elf sees it all the time. Now, this little flying saucer here is not just here for fun. I think that this idea, this model of reality, could be used to explain certain alien abduction phenomena that John Mack has wrote about. In that, rather than actually physically abducting you, if they have the technology to manipulate your neural structure, not necessarily by injecting you with DMT, but in some way, then they might draw you into their collective reality. So, I guess then the answer to the question, what is it like to be a machine elf? Well, the best way probably to find out is to smoke some DMT. Or you could email this little machine elf with any questions, and thank you very much.